everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on problem formulation and its connection to the literature review. This is part one, where we'll be going over how to formulate a research question based on a literature review. And then the second part is about actually conducting the literature review. So how do we come up with a research question? The first place we usually start is asking what problem we're interested in understanding more about. And in this case, for social workers, when we say problem, we're really referring to social problems. So all of those social problems that you reviewed in your history of social welfare policy class last semester. So things like, for example, child abuse, delinquency, poverty, racism, these are all social problems that social work researchers are interested in investigating. Alternatively, what population might you be interested in? So you can think of the problem first or start with the population as an alternative. So in terms of populations, you might be interested in survivors of violence, welfare recipients, homeless individuals, people in recovery. When we start with thinking about the population, though, it's important to kind of keep in mind that this population is experiencing a problem. So the two arrive at the same point in terms of coming up with a social problem that is of interest to study. The other thing to think about in terms of the social problem that you pick is that generally or usually this is going to be the dependent variable of interest. So remember we talked about how researchers are interested in outcomes. We're interested in what is related to or predicts or influences some sort of outcome. And usually the social problem we pick then becomes that dependent variable, with some exceptions, but I'll get into that in the next slide. So let's say we answer the first question with child abuse. What problem are we interested in? And let's say we say child abuse. In the shaping and refining process, the next question we ask ourselves is, okay, what about child abuse? Because child abuse is a very big concept, it's a very big problem. So are we interested in, for example, risk factors? So what predicts or puts children at risk for child abuse? Are we interested in, alternatively, the effects of child abuse? So in this case, if we are interested in the effects of child abuse, then child abuse is actually the independent variable. And the outcome that we're interested in is the consequences of child abuse. Are we interested in intergenerational abuse? Why some parents who were abused themselves go on to abuse their children? Or are we interested in services to intervene or services to prevent child abuse? And of course, there's many other aspects to child abuse that we can focus on as well. But let's say we pick intergenerational abuse for the purposes of this lecture. Then intergenerational abuse is the dependent variable of interest. I know that's kind of a confusing term, but essentially we're interested in child abuse. And what causes some parents to abuse their children. Child abuse is the outcome. However, we're specifically interested in it for the population of parents who were abused themselves. So some parents who were abused themselves go on to abuse their children while others don't. So that's the population we're interested in, and abuse of their child is the dependent variable or outcome of interest. So if it helps, just think of the outcome as abuse. Okay, further on in the process, we ask, what do studies say predicts intergenerational abuse? So in this case, one might wonder, is this our research question? Well, it's actually not our research question. We haven't come up with ours yet. What this question is asking is, of the literature out there, what have studies found is related to intergenerational abuse? So this question is a question for the literature. because all these studies have been done, and now we want to know as a whole, what do they say? So then we might ask ourselves, well, is that our research question then? What have these studies found? And it's not our research question yet either. The answer to this question is what will lead us to our own research question. So that's why I said the literature is used to come up with the research question at the very beginning of this presentation. That's the connection. And there are many ways to conduct a literature review. There's many different paths researchers take. And when you read your articles, you'll see that their literature reviews vary. I require all students, however, who are conducting literature reviews for the first time to do it a very specific way. And this is a way that I learned how to do my first research review, and it's a way that I think made it easier for me to see patterns across all the studies. I refined the method a little bit, but essentially I think this is the easiest for new students. Okay, so how do we do this? Broad steps. The literature review is organized around the dependent variable of interest. So our dependent variable was intergenerational abuse. So what that means is that all the studies that I include in my review have to have the same dependent variable. If I find a study where intergenerational abuse is the independent variable, for example, a study that's looking at how it affects academic achievement, then academic achievement of the child is the dependent variable, and intergenerational abuse is the independent variable. So in that case, that's not going to work for me at my review. I need all of them to have intergenerational abuse as the dependent variable, because I'm going to be synthesizing the results across all the other studies, all these studies in my review, by what independent variables they looked at as being predictors of the dependent variable, which was abuse. So for example, the studies may have looked at poverty as something that is related to intergenerational abuse, lack of therapy or lack of counseling services for the parent, substance abuse of the parent, and numerous other independent variables. So the literature review focuses on synthesizing and finding patterns across all these independent variables to see which ones are the significant predictors of the outcome of interest, intergenerational abuse. And then we highlight key studies to indicate patterns found per individual independent variables. This part we'll talk a little bit more about in the second video in terms of the mechanics of how to do the literature review. Okay, so getting to the research question. Once all the independent variables are described and conclusions drawn about what we know, the literature review ends with what is left for future research. This is known as the gap. So if we imagine that this is the foundation provided by our literature review, so these puzzle pieces are the independent variables that we found were related to our dependent variable, then this is the gap, or what we don't know. So at the end, we summarize and say, this is what we know. We know maybe poverty, maybe substance abuse is related to intergenerational abuse, but something is missing. Then your research question fills that gap. So maybe you look at poverty because no one else has, or only a few people have. And your research question becomes, how is poverty related to intergenerational abuse? Or is poverty related to intergenerational abuse? There's many different types of questions that we can ask based on what we find out from the literature. So as you can see then, the research question becomes very narrow and specific. And the literature review helps us get to that level of specificity. Some other things to consider with regard to coming up with a research question is the broad issue of feasibility. Think about time, access to data, energy, money. So in terms of time, you really only have 20 weeks to do your thesis or research project. So it has to be something that can be doable during that time. Think about data. Is this something that you're going to have to collect data on, or are there existing data out there? Your energy level and any money that might be required. As I mentioned, there are some funds to help graduate students, so talk to your advisor about that. Okay, so that's the end for this part, but don't forget to pop over to part 2 where we go over the mechanics of how to do a literature review. Oh, and here are the sources of the images used in the video. Okay, bye, see you next time.